Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Evoke cast. This one is for February 2025. And as usual, my co-host is Kylee Toth. And so we'll be fielding a bunch of questions. We're almost, I have to say, we're getting a little overloaded with the number of questions, which we love to get them, but we don't know that we're quite ready for the 3 hour version of this podcast. So we'll try to keep some of them a little bit, abbreviated, and hopefully that suffices. If they don't, just send us another email or ask questions about more confused if you're still confused. But if we were based on what I've seen so far, of the 19 questions that we had come in, many of them have multiple questions embedded in that one question. And so we could be here all day talking about that stuff. So we'll do our best, and hopefully we get to cover everything in maybe an hour, hour and a half, something like that. So
Or we'll have
uh,
to start doing two parts or something. We'll see.
we might. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for joining me, Kylee. This should be
Yeah,
fun.
no problem. Why don't we just dive right in because we have so many today.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, our first question is from Claire, and she says, if your trail running race was 42 kilometers and 3,000 meters, but there was another race event you wanted to partake in exactly 2 weeks prior to your A race, would you choose the 22-kilometer 1,000 meter option or the 35-kilometer 2,000 meter option? It
Okay, well,
is
let's answer that question first.
sure.
Yeah, you want to do the 22 with the lower elevation. And I don't even think we need to address the rest of that question,
Yeah, I
Kylee,
agree.
because there are issues when you're placing races close together. The big one, and this was, if you were doing local 5K in the city park, then that's not such a big deal. You could do one every week. But when you're doing races that take many hours at a time, that means you're going to need much more time to recover from these. So you have 2 weeks between your B race, I'm going to suggest a 22-kilometer, and your A race, which is, what is it, 42 with a lot of vertical. And you're going to need several days of recovery after the B race. And then you don't have any time to start training again because you really need to just taper now for your A race. So this means that your training ended just before your however long a taper you're going to do for this 22-kilometer race. Maybe because it's a B race, you're only going to do 2 or a couple, 3 days easy. But that means your training for the A race ended a few days before the B race happened because there's no way to return to training in a 2 week period between races. And we see this an awful lot with people who love to race and have, the social component of mountain running is really fun. But often folks stack races so close together that they're just, the race isn't making you fitter. Well, maybe this one, if you can run it conservatively, this 22-kilometer race, if you say you want to be competitive, but if you were to dial back a bit on it, then it could be used as a long training run. And I think that could be really beneficial for your big race. We often have people who are racing 100-mile races do 100-kilometer or 50 miles even. Up to 3 weeks, sometimes 3 to 4 weeks ahead of their primary A race. So but that gives them time to recover and then return to training. So this is a bit of a tight schedule, Claire.
Yeah, so yeah, you're recommending she does it's about half the kilometers of the race and a third of the elevation. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so probably not getting close to the actual race distance or elevation unless they're going very, very slow, perhaps. But yeah, I agree with you. We often program like a dress rehearsal for clients sometimes, I know as coaches, which is a similar concept to this, but not at race intensity either. right?
Yeah.
So,
Normally, I mean, that's why if you're using, if this truly is a B race and your A race is this big 42K race, then, treat this as training for the A race.
mhm.
Trying to be competitive in, both of them this close together, I have a feeling it's going to detract from your performance on the second race.
Yeah, but it's also I program this for skimo racers often, a dress rehearsal, and I tell them to use all the nutrition and gear exactly like they will for the race.
Yeah.
I think you told us to program this, but then you make hopefully all your mistakes in your practice,
Yeah.
which
Then
isn't
you get
always
your
the case.
you get your gear sorted out.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
I think it's a really good idea as well to, yes, treat it as if it were a real race, but just don't push quite as hard.
for sure.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so Scott, our next question is from Ross. And he says, I'm on a program as a mountain runner. For the first month of the year, I have focused extensively on building elevation gains. My issue is that I don't live near the mountains, which means a lot of up downs of shorter hills. As a result, I feel like I've sacrificed my mileage on flatter trails and not been able to build any fast downhills. I feel like my overall performance has taken a hit with the new workload to gain the elevation. Is this dip in performance normal while I focus on climbing as my body adapts to the new stimulus? Soon I will incorporate some faster trails into my plan. Hopefully, the strength of the climbing will get me back to the performance I know I'm capable of. What do you think of this approach, I guess?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, yes, when you start adding a lot more elevation gain and loss, your mileage is going to take a hit. There's no way. Let's say it takes you, if you were running 100 miles a week on flat ground, that's going to take you 10 or 12 hours. Well, if it's on hilly terrain, you're probably going to could even cut that in half. You could be down to 50 miles in a week for the same training hours, which is one of the reasons we primarily train by hours and not miles for mountain runners. They're not kilometers, because it's really time on your feet that's going to be beneficial. But another thing to keep in mind is that when you change the training stimulus, you'll always see a decline immediate decline, initial decline in performance, because you're not adapted to that. The reason you're doing this new thing because you recognize, oh, I'm not very good at going uphill. And so you'll have to expect that this is going to take your performance is going to take a hit, especially on flatter ground, because there's a muscular endurance component to running uphill and downhill that is somewhat different than running on flats. One possibility would, before you get into a really hilly block of training, is to preface it with a block of muscular endurance training before you move into the hill work, so that your legs are you have a little more strength and muscular endurance in your legs. But I think you're seeing the conflict that exists in mountain running, is that you do need the volume, you do need the distance, because let's say you're going to be in a 50-mile race. Well, you need to be able to run 50 miles. But the challenge then is, okay, if my 50-mile race also has a lot of vertical in it, I need to be able to go up and downhill. This, I believe this is probably the biggest challenge in training
Hmm.
for mountain running. And I did write an article not too long ago that we published about training for mountain running and some of the things you could consider. So I would suggest go read that and see if that doesn't help you. But I don't think what you're experiencing in the long run is going to be a problem for you. It's just that in the near term, it's going to probably mean you're moving slower and covering less ground.
Yeah, Scott, I think that this is a question that lots of the trail runners would have. And it sounds like he's like hyper focusing on the uphill. And then I know some athletes kind of, or like hyper focus isn't maybe the word, but do a training block of the opposite would be like speed work and leg speed, and they're not going uphill. the adaptations of him focusing on uphill, I wouldn't imagine he should now just drop all the uphill and now just focus on running flat to probably merge the two, would you say? Or
Yeah, I
because,
think a mix is good. And one thing we haven't addressed, sorry, excuse me for jumping in
yeah,
here, but
no,
I
that's great.
realized we didn't say something about the downhills. But if you live on, hilly terrain, it sounds like you do, that yours are short hills, um, then you can train fast downhills. So, one of your days when you're and typically what I do with folks is on a day when they're training intensity, so maybe some zone 3 uphill intervals, they will get to the top of the hill and turn around immediately and run fast downhill before taking some kind of a rest, or the opposite. They will start with a fast downhill leg, and then at the bottom of that, turn around immediately and go uphill for that
Mhm,
same distance.
mhm,
And I think that's a good way to combine because as we all know, running downhill can cause a lot of muscle damage. And so getting good at it and preparing your legs for it, that's often what makes people's legs just give out in these mountain runs is a lot of downhill running.
mhm. Yeah, just one thing came to mind that people might find interesting. Um, with Tom Evans, when he probably first came to you, he was had more of a flat running profile, right?
Yep.
Less. And so you probably did you work with him on gaining that elevation, but then how did you make sure he didn't become just like a slow hiker all the time? How do you keep that
Yeah.
high end? Hmm.
Well, luckily he's endowed with really good speed. And
Yeah.
so actually in one of our other questions, I used Tom as an example, but I'll try to illustrate it here. And
Hmm.
he's got such what we call, there's a term called speed reserve. And that means, you're in sprinting it or in track events, it would mean the difference between your highest speed and your average race speed. And the bigger that speed reserve is, in other words, the higher your speed, your maximum speed is relative to your race pace, the better you're going to do. And now, when you get to ultra running, where the average pace is often quite slow, even for the elites, it could be in the average pace at Western States the year that Tom won. I think it was something around 8.5 minute miles. But Tom can comfortably run several 4.5 minute miles in a row. And so he's got so much speed reserve that it's not going to benefit him I mean, we can step away and deprioritize or de-emphasize the speed work or the fast running, although we still do probably 1 to 2 workouts a week that are fast, often on a track. And so just to stay in touch with that speed, but it's not, we're training at, so let's say his average race pace is going to be, 8 minute miles, but there will be a good part of that race where the pace is probably faster than even 6 minute miles. So we do a lot of that track work at a 5 minute mile pace.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I mean, it's kind of complicated when you start.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's much more challenging to train mountain runners than it is road runners or even track runners, because for them, every step is the same. The ground is flat. There's no hills. You don't have to, I mean, they're challenging. Those races are challenging. I'm not meaning to put them down in any way. It's incredible. I love watching them. In fact, say maybe people here just saw Jacob Ingebrigtsen broke the indoor mile world record yesterday. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah,
But
incredible.
training for something like the indoor mile is very straightforward in terms
Mhm.
of the kind of work you need to do. You just need to be able to run really fast for a long time. Whereas
Yeah.
with the mountain runner, you've got all these other factors, the duration for one thing, and then the downhill that just can beat the heck out of your legs so that you then have to walk uphill. So
Hmm.
it takes longer, I believe, to become proficient at mountain running.
Hmm. Yeah, I'd agree. The more variables there are out of our hands, the more complex the training seems to be. It's same like track cycling is quite or road cycling, you use watts, and there's all these, everything is so measurable. But as soon as we add a more dynamic environment, it's harder for sure.
Yeah,
Right.
these mountain sports are, which we've talked about this and written
Hmm.
a great deal about it in the books. That's the reason we gravitate towards or prefer something like heart rate as an intensity metric, because we don't have good power meters and we can't, it's not like, when Jacob Ingebrigtsen goes to the track, he knows exactly how fast his race pace is, and hence how fast his training pace needs to be depending on the kind of workout. We don't have that luxury.
Hmm.
And so we're left with this more compromised method. And I think a lot of mountain running coaches are starting to figure this out a little bit. That's one of the reasons we're seeing times dropping so much. I mean, record-breaking race times all over the place.
Hmm.
People are getting much, much faster. Um, but it
Yeah,
is,
absolutely.
which makes it pretty interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's why we like our job. It's
Yeah.
not like training, little mice or hamsters. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question, Scott, is from someone who is currently following the 24-week mountaineering training plan for spring ski mountaineering objectives. And they're asking, how often should I do long zone 2 uphill workouts or zone 2 uphill water carries on my skis? Should I count uphill and downhill time towards the prescribed workout?
Okay,
So
the first question is
they're not doing my ski touring plan, they're doing the
the
mountaineering plan.
mountaineering. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the mountaineering plan will be a good plan for preparation for like spring volcano
Mhm.
skiing or spring mountain skiing. But if you're following that plan, it stipulates both the frequency and the timing of those workouts.
Mhm.
So my recommendation is follow the plan. That plan has been proven effective by many hundreds of people.
Mhm.
So I don't think you need to second guess it or think you need to add more in than what it says. Because it's laid out in a pretty nice progressive manner
Mhm.
with 3 8-week blocks with different focuses on those 8 weeks. So I'll just conclude by saying stick to that plan.
Mhm.
Um, and then counting uphill and downhill, this was also covered, I'm pretty sure, in the plan, um, is if you're outside, count the downhill time as part of the overall time. However, if you're indoors on a treadmill or a stair machine or something like that, just count the amount of time you're going uphill. So let's say the workout is to be an hour long, but you're going outside to do this, so you would run uphill for 45 minutes or 40 minutes, let's say, turn around and run back downhill for 20. You'd have covered roughly an hour. And they're both very beneficial training stimuli, both the uphill and the down. They're different, but they're beneficial. We don't
Mhm.
have that option when you're indoors, unless you happen to have a treadmill that will go negative, and some of them do. So you can actually run downhill. But I would say if you're on a treadmill or a stair machine, just count the uphill time. So you just can go uphill for an hour for that workout.
No, I think that's good advice. And uh, the ski touring plan also has options that are more ski specific if you find that you want something just for skiing. But it sounds like this person is training for kind of both foot mountaineering and skiing. So
Yes, for sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
Our next question is from Murillo. I apologize if I say your name wrong, but
Murillo, I think,
Murillo. Yeah.
yeah, I would think, yeah.
Okay. And he says, I'm not a client, but a big fan of your work and have a question for your podcast. And first of all, we love that people send us questions, even if you don't purchase anything from Evoke. That's part of the reason we we do this is to give free information as well, because I know that's important to you, Scott, to get good information out to everybody. So
Sure. That's why
yeah,
we're doing this very podcast right now.
exactly.
Mhm.
He says, I've been doing zone 2 training for a long time and noticed that after a few days doing Wim Hof breathing, Wim Hof, sorry, that
Yep.
my heart rate will stay a lot lower than normal during these sessions. Have you heard or experienced this? I always wondered why, and also if this would be somewhat cheating and not really bringing me the appropriate benefits of zone 2 long runs.
Yeah, some good questions there.
Mhm.
Well, first of all, I'm only in just very minimally up to speed on the Wim Hof breathing methods.
Mhm.
And I don't see any reason why I think they're probably a fine thing to be doing. I'm not sure, how much benefit they're going to give you in your overall fitness. I kind of think he mainly is focused more on the health aspect of this rather than the fitness aspect of it. But you could do a couple of things here. Because what we're really interested in, I mean, your body, we want to give it the same stimulus, whether you're breathing with his methods or just regular breathing. So, run at the same running at the same pace will give that same stimulus. So let's say your aerobic threshold heart rate is 150 and or 130, let's say it's a little bit lower, 130 and a 10-minute mile pace. Well, then you should, when you switch over and you get a lower heart rate with the Wim Hof breathing, you should still just be targeting that 10-minute mile pace because then the muscles are going to be getting the same stimulus.
Mhm.
And if you're really curious about all this, you could do your own experiment. Train for 3 weeks only using the Wim Hof breathing method. And at the end of that, see if your average pace has improved at your previously determined aerobic threshold heart rate. And then switch over and do 3 weeks of normal breathing, zone 2 training, and see again at the end, do basically an aerobic threshold time trial and see if you've improved. And then you would probably find, if you only have one data point or one guinea pig to do this on, you're kind of be counting on, it's going to be tough to quantify that, but it might
Mhm.
help you a little bit if you're really curious about that. But I would say the main thing to focus on is the pace.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. And a lot of these methods are becoming a bit in vogue of the breathing and the cold exposure therapies and all of this stuff combined with the breathing. So
Yeah.
this might be an area um, we'll see more of and more information on too as it becomes uh, more used by multitudes of people. We'll see. Mhm.
Yeah.
Our next question we have here, Scott, is from someone who has had a running injury, and they say, due to a running injury, I've been spending a lot of time on a bike trainer and was curious what you thought about modifying targets for long aerobic efforts. I've defined an aerobic lactic threshold using a heart rate drift test, but after 90 minutes, start to decouple greater than 5%. For long efforts, aiming to build to 4 hours, would you recommend starting at a lower power / pace such that decoupling doesn't go past 5%, or progressively lowering power / pace to stay around the defined heart rate? Or does the heart rate not matter and I should just continue on? I find heart rate jumps around a bit and it would be hard to gauge accurately without a custom field that is a rolling average or a decoupling value. He says he would test his blood lactate, but he doesn't have the funds to do that. This is an interesting question.
Yeah, I think for very long runs or rides, either one, you're going to want to be, probably starting down there in zone 1 and because your heart rate will drift up into zone 2 during that long run. I have used the other method, which is to as you just progressively lower your power and your pace to stay around that your selected heart rate that you're looking for. So you would basically just be getting slower through the ride. And I think the big issue with the first method is, or excuse me, with this method, no, sorry, with the first method, which is to start easy and or no, excuse me, I'm trying to read this as I talk, and I can't do that. I can't walk and chew gum, but trying to maintain the aerobic threshold heart rate for the entire duration, whether it's 90 minutes or 4 hours, is likely going to be an exhausting workout. And so I think you'll have to be careful to not put yourself under by trying to stay right at that aerobic threshold heart rate and pace. That's why I'm saying, normally when I like people I work, we don't really work with cyclists, but I would think the analogy would be the same, is that you're going to do these really long runs or rides starting in zone 1, and your heart rate will drift up to zone 2. That would allow you to accumulate a lot of aerobic volume, but without near the fatigue of trying to ride 4 hours at the aerobic threshold. I think most people will struggle with that unless you're a pro.
Yeah, Scott, would it vary depending on the spread between your aerobic and anaerobic? Like if I tried the spread between my aerobic and anaerobic, being a high performance athlete, is very small. So if I tried to spend 4 hours at my aerobic threshold, it just wouldn't happen. I would
Yeah,
explode.
it would be like a race effort. Yeah,
Yeah.
really.
But for someone who has a very large spread, is it possible, or do they also fatigue as well?
Well,
You
they
know?
will fatigue, but that's a
Mhm.
good point to bring up. Thank you for doing that.
I'm just curious.
Um, no, yes, this does have something to do with your level of fitness, because the fitter person like you, Kylee, your
Mhm.
aerobic threshold is so high, you're making, let's say you were on a bike, you'd be making very close to the same power at the aerobic threshold as you would at the anaerobic threshold.
Mhm.
And maybe they're going to differ by less than 10%, 5 to 8%, something like that. So
Mhm.
training at the aerobic threshold for you is almost as taxing as training in zone 3.
Mhm.
And that you'll blow up if you try to do that for 4 hours, as you just said. And so if this person is quite aerobically deficient and there's a big spread, like we often see, maybe 30% spread between aerobic and anaerobic thresholds, then chances are the power output at aerobic threshold, the speed that they're riding at, is low enough that the fatigue won't be that high. So that's a good point, and thank you again for bringing that up, because I think it depends on the athlete, and you need to monitor your fatigue. And if you are, you know, feeling like if your RPE is going through the roof after, you're on a 90-minute ride and your RPE is, now gone from 3 to 7, then you're working probably way too hard for that long of an effort. If RPE is going up and holding the same pace, heart rate will go down
Okay.
because the muscles, remember, are the muscles are a slave to the heart is really a slave to the muscle. And
Mhm.
so if the muscle is fatiguing and it can't produce the same power level,
Yeah.
then the heart doesn't need to supply as much blood. And so you'll
Mhm.
see heart rate drop. This is
Yes.
what you see often in like ultra distance racing
Mhm.
is,
Mhm.
they may start off racing at 160 and by the finish they're barely hitting 130
Yes,
because their legs are so tired.
I've experienced this. You trained me last year with the BC bike race, even though don't do cycling, but you made an exception for me. Uh, and that was the case after an hour and a half or 2 hours of each stage, you just can't get your heart rate up anymore.
That's
Like to
right. Exactly. Yeah.
it's just,
I think I've said this on several other of our podcasts, but I think it bears repeating because I think it's a concept that most people don't get is if you have high RPE and a low heart rate, that's an indication of fatigue. And the fatigue
Mm,
could be of, many different kinds, but if it's coming 4 hours into a ride, you know where that fatigue is coming from. It's your local muscular fatigue. Now,
mhm,
if your RPE is low and your heart rate is high, that typically means you're very well rested and you're ready to perform at a high level.
mhm.
So keep those two, very simple little tool. So like, one day you go out for what should be an easy run or easy ride, and you're thinking, man, I just can't hit the watts that I should or the pace that I
Mhm.
should. And my heart rate's down there in, 120. Normally it would be 135 running at this pace. Then you should turn around and go home
Yeah.
because that's a really good indication that your legs need a break.
Yeah, for sure. Would you, I mean, we've never seen a heart rate profile of like a Tour de France rider. Well, I haven't,
No,
but
I haven't.
yeah, I would be curious how close to their thresholds they can hold for the duration. Probably they're in the peloton for a lot of it, so they
That's
probably
the
get those
thing.
micro breaks by drafting, would be my
That's
guess.
the thing about cycling, I think, that is
Yeah.
makes it, it's one of the reasons, let's say, cycling is unique in that cyclists typically can take in more carbohydrate per hour because they
Hmm.
don't have the jostling that you get with running.
Right. Yeah.
And they also, you get to just literally coast on the
Hmm.
downhills
Hmm.
or soft pedal in a pack. If
Yeah,
you're sitting in the middle of a pack of 25 people, you can, your legs are barely going around and you can stay with them.
for sure.
So that's very different. I mean, I don't know what the average pace or average heart rate
Hmm.
looks like in those long cycling races. Maybe it would be not useful because those people that are doing those kind of multi-day or super long races are in a different league in terms of
Yeah,
fitness from most of us.
for sure.
But I do think it's important to keep that in mind, this whole heart rate to RPE thing.
Hmm. Yeah, that is something I find. I've done some running races and cycling races, and that is a very big difference that I notice and that I actually find really punishing about running. There's no part of running where I'm coasting.
Yeah.
Like I find, but I guess aid stations, people can get little bits of recovery, but it's very high impact and steady, I
Yeah,
suppose,
there's
energy
no the
expenditure.
downhills, instead of the downhills being an opportunity to rest, the
Hmm.
downhills are just beating up your legs even more when
Totally.
you're
Yeah.
running. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So our next question, Scott, is from Pietro from Italy. And he says, I'm almost done with the 16 muscular endurance sessions, but what's after? I used to do strength training all year long, and I'd like to know, for example, how many reps I should do and how much weight to use. So he's gone through the full muscular endurance cycle and wants to know next steps, I guess.
Okay, well, here's how we would work with you if you were coming to us for coaching. Is if you were a runner or a skimo racer, then we would put a block of a, that gym muscular endurance that you're almost finished with in front of a transition into more conventional uphill weighted intervals or uphill intervals, not weighted, excuse me, if you're uphill intervals. Now, if you're a mountaineer, you would do the same thing. You could do the block of gym ME and then follow it with a transition to heavy weighted uphill pack carries. So it just really depends on what you're after. Now, it sounds like you're asking really what kind of strength training should you do? Normally, after a long block like this, again, I guess it depends on your goal and your level, but typically we're using muscular endurance because that's the biggest factor in fatigue in these long events is local muscular fatigue. And if that's your goal, then you could keep doing muscular endurance work for, months if you wanted, I suppose. But we often will shift people back to a max strength block for about 8 weeks and then return to the muscular endurance because if you elevate a person's max strength, then their muscular endurance will be better.
Yeah, I agree, Scott. That's often what I do with clients as well.
Yeah.
Our next
But
question.
and let me
Go
finish
ahead.
one thing.
Yeah.
So Petra, or Pietro, I can't really tell, is if you, we can't really tell you how many sets and reps and weights to use, because I don't know, maybe you weigh, 50 kilos, maybe you weigh 100 kilos. I don't have any idea about how much you weigh. So, I'm really not comfortable just saying, okay, you need to do this many sets with this much weight of these exercises. So sorry, I can't answer that.
Okay, Scott, our next question is from Dan, and he's asking, I was wondering what advice you would have for combining road running and mountain running in one season in terms of periodization and the different demands of mountain and road running. There's lots of people, even our coaches have experimented with this, Andy and Luke this year, last year.
Yeah. I think well, this is a great question, and it's gonna be a long answer, so everybody
So
hold tight.
buckle up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to start off with an example. So Tom Evans tried something similar last year when over the winter he decided to target the world championships in cross country running, which he did make the team for. Those courses are pretty flat compared to mountain running, so have a little more similarity to road running. Speed is a big, big factor in those races. They're running, well under 3-minute kilometers for those races, even though can be somewhat muddy and a little bit hilly. But at the end, as we transitioned in the springtime into more mountain running, we both concluded that it had not really been a very good preparation period for mountain races, especially the ultra races. And the reason for that is going back to that thing we talked about. I mentioned speed reserve early on. If you're a slower runner, then speeding up, learning to run faster and training to run faster on flat ground will transfer over to making you faster in the mountains. If you have a lot of speed reserve, like Tom, then doing more of this flat speed running is not going to be as effective as doing more event-specific training on hills, up and down. So, as an example, let's say that you could run, just pick any number here that suits you, 7-minute mile pace for a 5 kilometer on the flats. Then your mountain running will probably benefit a lot if you can improve that speed, and you're going to do that in a period where you're really just focused on running flatter and faster. You're going to kind of forego the hilly training for this. So it might be better to do that well before your mountain running season, or even have a whole season where you're just focused on improving your average running pace. And because I think that when you get like in these mountain races, even the elites, like I mentioned earlier, in Western states, Tom's average pace was, year he won it was, let's say, a little over 8-minute mile pace. And about 6 minutes per mile is about the fastest that runners are going to hit in those races. So if you can comfortably run a sub 5-minute mile pace, then an 8-minute and a 6-minute are not going to feel particularly fast to you. So, think about it in terms of the speed reserve. So if you've got a big speed reserve, then just train in the mountains. If you don't have much speed reserve, then you probably would benefit from some focused training. And I'm not familiar exactly with what Andy did before Hard Rock, but I do know he did train for a marathon in part of his buildup. And the same with Luke. Luke Nelson was, when I first started, started working with Luke, I don't know, over 10 years ago. And he was so good on the uphills that when he went in those sky running races that they have in Norway that are just ridiculously steep, he would
Mhm.
inevitably be the top of the hill before anybody else. But
Yeah.
then they'd get up to the top on those rolling plateaus, and suddenly everybody's running a 6 minute mile pace, and Luke could
Mhm.
not run a 6 minute
Mhm.
mile pace.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so then he shifted to doing some training, and he like Andy, he focused on a marathon, and that transferred over really well to his mountain running. Both of them had, very good racing seasons after their marathon training.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, Scott. It really depends on your training history and background. Like Luke was a skimo racer like me. If I were to train for a flat half marathon or something, the best thing I could do is run flat a lot because I'm terrible
Yes.
at it.
Right.
So I think it
Yeah.
does really depend on your strengths and weaknesses where to focus more energy. Or your training history is more accurate than your strengths and weaknesses. So
Sure.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm. God, here's a question that we have from an email from Brandon, and he said, "I'd love to get your thoughts on high rep core circuits like those involving 5 to 10 core exercises with 30 seconds per exercise and little to no rest between. These types of core blast routines seem really popular with athletes that I follow on social media. I'm currently following your 24-week mountaineering plan. I'm on week 20 and seeing great results, but I've noticed the plan uses more of a max strength protocol for core training. I'm curious, why does the plan lean in this direction instead of incorporating high rep circuits? Are there times when these high rep core circuits would be beneficial, or are they just a mainstream fitness trend? Thanks for your advice." Mhm.
Well, I would say that you nailed it there. They are kind of a, fad, a fitness fad. Yes, they're going to be hard and you're going to be sore and tired and sweaty and you're going to feel like you did some training. So very much like any kind of high intensity circuit style work, you're going to feel like you've done a workout when you get done. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if that's what you like, then that'd be great. But something to be thinking about. Um, they're kind of time consuming. They're probably going to take longer to recover from,
Mhm.
they're going to be slower to show gains in actual strength because these are really muscular endurance training. They're not strength training. And so you'll see gains in muscular endurance, but you probably won't see gains in strength.
Mhm.
So because the core muscles are predominantly slow twitch, so they're already endowed with really good endurance. But now you're going to try to make them have even more endurance by doing, 1,000 sit-ups or something. Um,
Mhm.
but those same muscles, because they're so slow twitch, are quite poor in max strength. So
Mhm.
our approach to these workouts, because we don't want them to be too exhausting and we don't want them to be too time consuming, is to use a max strength type protocol with them because if we improve the strength in general, if you improve the strength of a muscle, its muscular endurance increases.
Mhm.
And that's because those muscles can now operate at a lower percentage of their maximum strength, and therefore they're going to last longer before they lose their force production. Now, this whole idea of, building max strength to improve endurance works only up to a point. Otherwise, Olympic weightlifters would be the fastest marathoners, and we know that is not the case.
Mhm.
Um, but I'd say that, those we have seen tremendous results with these max strength routines. And I'll give a
Mhm.
couple of examples. In the Training for the New Alpinism book, there's an article that describes a pull-up routine. So pull-ups, it's a relatively small muscle group that
Mhm.
fatigues pretty quickly. So not too dissimilar to doing, let's say, crunches or Russian twists or whatever you're talking about doing. Um, so it's the same idea, but what most people we've worked with, what they want to improve the number of pull-up repetitions they can do, they can use this program that's written out in that book that basically will never have them doing in any set, in any workout, more than 3 repetitions.
Mm.
And a total number of reps in some of these workouts will be, a 10 or a dozen reps in the whole workout, but they're under very high load. So they're going to be, doing a pull-up with added resistance on their body. And I've had a friend actually a few years ago who took me up on this and said, "Hey, I want to be able to do 30 pull-ups. I can only do 10." And so I put him on this 8-week training program of just doing max pull-up strength. And boom, he did some over 30 pull-ups within 8 weeks, after 8 weeks. And we do that. I've done the same thing with special operations guys who have to perform tests like, the number of sit-ups they can do in a minute or 2 minutes, depending on where they are. And I will have them do weighted incline sit-ups with a max strength protocol. So they're holding, let's say, a 45-pound plate on their chest and doing incline sit-ups with that. Again, not doing more than, a few reps in a set. And they just knock it out of the park when it comes to the actual test, which is more of a muscular endurance test. So, again, you can do both, but I think that with all the other training you're doing, really trashing yourself by jacking up lactate levels and going to exhaustion in these circuits is going to detract from a lot of the other training you could be doing.
Yeah, the only time I've seen this kind of thing, I was a personal trainer and I taught exercise classes at gyms, and oftentimes this kind of a HIIT or quick style core workout would be added in by some people for interest, like just to mix it up. People are coming, but
Sure.
as a trainer, as soon as you increase the speed of an exercise too, you also increase the chance of injury. So that's another thing that you with these social media style workouts, you have to make sure form doesn't decline if you're rapidly firing off different core exercises. So that's another thing to kind of caution with. And then I have kind of a quick weeds question for you that other people might ask you about the core. Some, like in some sports where they have to have like a quick response with their core, like maybe gymnastics or something where there's like a, so is our core just all slow twitch muscle and that's just a neurological reaction you're training, or is there fast twitch merit in your core
Yeah.
fibers? I don't know.
There
I'm
probably
curious.
is some fast twitch, but I've just read in a number of places that slow twitch muscles are, core muscles are slow twitch
Okay.
predominantly. Now, which means that, again, they're not very well endowed with strength. Well, if you're not well endowed with strength, it's going to be hard to become powerful. So if you need to make quick, powerful movements, you probably will benefit from doing increased strength rather than, increasing your strength through a max strength protocol than increasing your muscular endurance. And but I've seen the same thing, and I agree. From the standpoint of variety, and if you're in a group setting, these are fun. That's why they're so popular. But I think for athletes, what an athlete is trying to use training for is to improve their performance in a specific type of an event. They're not just looking. The gym is not their event. So going in there and destroying themselves in a 30-minute circuit workout of some kind isn't probably going to transfer very well over to their event, because that means all their more event specific training will probably be compromised by the fatigue that they bring to it from this type of training. So
No,
I think
that is a really good point, because sometimes on social, when we see these type of workouts, some people their event is the gym, like there is gym competitions, and so it is as you said, we're trying to become good at mountaineering or ski mountaineering or rock climbing. So I think keeping the
And you
focus.
can do ballistic and plyometric type work with your core training. Yuri Verkhoshansky has a whole book that covers this kind of stuff. But just to give an example of what this might look like, let's say the athlete is hanging from a pull-up bar and they're doing straight leg lifts. So they're bringing their feet as high as they can while they're hanging from the bar. And then what could happen is as they fatigue, then, or in a different set, I should have said, partway through the range of motion, a partner will push down really hard on their feet.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like a ballistic effect of like plyometrics. So you can develop a lot more power that way. You can train those muscles for power rather than just strength. I mean, strength is a good thing. And I think strength, one of the things I think is really beneficial for core strength development is the plank, and especially the TRX saw plank, which I think we've got some demos on that. But basically, you're on your forearms on the floor with your feet in the TRX straps, and then you saw your body back and forth horizontally. And the reason this is such a good exercise is that the deepest core muscle that we have that is actually acts like kind of like a girdle, it's called the transverse abdominis, and it's pretty much what holds your guts in. It attaches to the spine and then wraps all the way around, and then all the other core muscles, the obliques and the rectus abdominis, they're layered on top of that muscle. The problem, I mean, those other muscles, the obliques and the rectus abdominis, those are muscles you can see, and as a consequence, are relatively easy to activate. So, when you do a sit-up, that's what's happening. That rectus abdominis is doing most of the work to get you to do a sit-up, or hanging leg raises would be the same thing. But this transverse abdominis isn't a muscle that moves. It's a stabilizer. Its job is to stabilize the hips to the ribs to the shoulders. So you've got the intercostal muscles in the ribs that help do this, but it's to create a solid platform from which you can move. So that, let's say you're a climber, having a really strong core or really strong transverse abdominis will help you apply power through your feet and hands. Similarly, running, if your hips are just like a loose universal joint and wobbly all over the place, that's going to be, first of all, potentially injurious. And then secondly, it's going to be much more inefficient, much less efficient and more energy consumptive. So having a solid transverse abdominis, I think should be a goal for pretty much every true athlete.
Yeah.
And the thing, again, like I said, the difficulty with it is that it's really not designed to move body parts. It's designed to stabilize those body parts so they don't move. And that makes it hard to activate.
You, without knowing too, if any women are listening to this podcast and you've had any sort of pregnancy, take note of what Scott said, because that's a lot of what you work on postpartum and planks is one of the most favorite exercises to work on that kind of stuff, and breathing exercises during pregnancy as well.
Good idea.
It's really important. So that was quite a long tangent on core, but we haven't had a core question, so that's
no,
good.
we haven't. We haven't had one in a while.
It was interesting. Our next question, Scott, is this person is a 40-year-old
long COVID.
a 40-year-old male longtime runner and former mountaineer. I've appreciated your books over the years and especially your podcast. Unfortunately, I came down with long COVID 2+ years ago after a mild infection. While I've improved a little bit, I still have a significantly higher heart rate, muscle pain, and weakness exercising, and much less endurance. While I can shuffle along, it's like someone lopped off about 20% of my capacity, and I have data to back this up. It's definitely not deconditioning either. I'm experienced enough to know what that feels like, and this ain't it, he says. So while I'm not looking for medical advice, I've seen many doctors. I'm wondering if you've seen long COVID among athletes you've worked with and gleaned any practical, tactical tips for helping folks come back.
Boy, I feel sorry for you that this has happened because I've known a number of people who have, I don't really know what qualifies as long COVID, but I do know a number of people that have seen the top lopped off of their fitness level by COVID, myself being one of them. I mean, I still am struggling a little bit with not being able to get my heart rate higher. My breathing is much shorter, so much tighter. So I'm sympathetic to your plight. One of our coaches, Ben Huseby, a couple of years ago came down with COVID that lasted quite a long time. And I think it took him well over a year before he could get back to his normal training routine. One of the mistakes I can have seen that I would caution anyone against is trying to return to training too soon after you have COVID. I've seen this with a number of athletes, and I'm sure some of our other coaches have too, where a person is eager, they've got a big goal of them going to go climb this mountain in 4 months. So I can't afford to not to stop training. So they want to jump back into training 2 weeks after they've had COVID. And I've seen that relapse occurrence on several occasions where people just relapsed back into, the infection seemed to come back and their symptoms came back again. So I would caution people to be, really careful. If you do get sick, be very gentle about returning to training over the course of probably a few weeks. And if the first signs that you're not progressing, you need to probably stop. I wish there was a better answer for this person, but I'm afraid I don't have one.
Yeah, Scott, do you, just curious, question, do most people think that the long COVID, your immune system is still depressed, or is it like, damage in your cardiovascular system, or they're not sure?
I think well, from what we know, what little we know about, or what little I should say about COVID is that it seems to affect different people in different ways. I mean, everything from brain fog to shortness of breath. I mean, and so I think its effect is so
Right,
multifactorial
facet, yeah.
that it's just very hard to say, oh, it's this or that. But I just, and then you couple this with the aging phenomenon, like in my case. Well, yeah, I'm now, let's say, 3 years older than when I had COVID. So of course I'm going to be slower and struggle more
Right.
with heart rate and breathing and everything else. So I can't really say how much is due to the COVID, but I do know I've never been able to return to the level I was before.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's tricky for sure. Yeah. I have a number of people in my world who are high performance athletes who they're not dealing with long COVID, but an pneumonia or another one just sick. And then it takes a lot longer than people often want to return to exercise. And it's really hard as a coach because all they want to do is just get back. But really the answer is you have to rest because
You do.
it
Yeah.
sucks. But yeah, listen
Yep.
to your body.
Yep.
Yeah. So our next question here, Scott, is someone is currently training for a Pacific Northwest volcano season with the ultimate goal of skiing Rainier in a day. They've been hitting the gym since the fall and have done a general strength phase and are now wrapping up a max strength phase. I have read, this person says they have read some forum topics that their legs may be strong enough from doing those strength workouts previously. Okay, Scott, I got to restart this one. It's
Yep.
getting convoluted.
No, that's okay. I mean, we don't even need to restart. This is another person that's asking a whole bunch of questions at one time. And it's great to have this background, and we do appreciate it. It makes our job easier to answer. But this person wants to know basically is their leg strength probably sufficient? And for the goal of skiing these volcanoes, or do they need to work on more max strength? And I would say this person can do over 50% of their body weight for like barbell box step ups or split squats, or
Mm-hmm.
no, excuse me, barbell box split squats. So it's like a Bulgarian split squat with 50% of his body weight. I'd say you're plenty strong enough. You don't need to be that strong for these multi-hour endurance events. And this is goes back to what I was saying about the Olympic weightlifters. Yes, being stronger can be beneficial. Like if you couldn't lift,
Mm-hmm.
let's say 15 or 20% of your body weight, then getting stronger would probably be beneficial. But I rarely see people. I mean, well, we know people who are not particularly strong that are incredibly good at moving uphill fat quickly.
Actually,
So
majority actually, I would say, have a much leaner profile with these
yeah,
long single push events like the FKTs. Jack is not to throw him here, but he's a bit of an exception with his he's quite strong uh, and tall. A lot
yeah,
of these like Killian or in Skimo, because we're talking about skiing. Axel Molleret, she's the world champion in the individual event, very fast, tiny person. So
yeah. Remy Bonnet would
Remy,
be another
yeah.
person who's, quite small
Mhm.
of stature, fairly thin and lean, and they can move uphill very
Mhm.
fast.
Yeah.
So what I would say is this 215-pound guy would probably benefit from doing a lot less hypertrophy
Mhm.
inducing strength training and shedding 15 or 20 pounds. I mean, I have no idea what your lean body mass and all that stuff is, but getting lighter is going to make going uphill a lot easier.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is that the biggest limitation for you is the muscular endurance because these events last hours and hours at a time.
Mhm.
And so, as I've said many times and two or three times already today, local muscular fatigue is going to be what causes you to slow down. And what we have found is the best antidote to that local muscular fatigue is some type of muscular endurance training. There's many others. So, he also mentions that he's aerobically quite deficient.
Mm.
Well, and it's important that you maintain that or to build that, but you can do that in a muscular endurance block of training, both attack your aerobic deficiency and muscular endurance. Um,
Mhm.
and if you live in a place that is, you can't get out into the mountains all the time, I would say one of the best workouts you can do is weighted hikes on a Stairmaster with ankle weights that are equal to your ski, boot, and skin weight.
Mhm.
So for many people, they'll be having, what you know better, Kylie, but probably 3 kilos on a foot, and even in a fairly light set. What does your race setup weigh?
My boots are just like under 600 grams, so
Hmm.
they're super light. And then, um, yeah, the skis are what,
They're
12 or
about a they're about a
100.
thousand grams, I
Yeah,
think,
with
for
bindings. Yeah,
yeah.
they're
Mhm.
really
And
really light.
But
You know,
most people who are
not
going to go ski volcanoes are going to
sure.
have boots that weigh,
Yeah.
2 pounds each at least, one
Yeah,
kilo. Yeah.
yeah, not to get into the weeds for this guy, but because this is the area that I spent a lot of time, I would, anybody wanting to do a single push on anything, do a heavy audit of your gear. Weight on your back, weight on your feet. It is so much harder over time. If you're talking, you know, 10, well, 7 to 15 hours of movement, you're adding a lot of time just with gear. So even your
Yeah.
backpack, like see what's in there, even a light backpack itself, the backpack itself, um,
Yeah.
that those are really important factors. Unfortunately, it is a little bit like road cycling or mountain biking where you kind of can buy a little bit of speed. So,
Yes, you can. Yeah, definitely can. Yeah, but
um,
weight is a huge component. And it's, I mentioned earlier that, if this person stops doing so much strength training, they will probably lose some muscle mass, which could make them faster going
mhm,
uphill.
mhm,
Um,
for sure. And then, yeah, I would focus some of that time maybe that you're putting on the mat on the strength and get also look at your technique, like think about movement economy on your skis and stuff like that. Because you're doing one movement over and over and over and over, you can make that a little bit more efficient. Overall, you're
mhm.
gonna save energy, things like that. It's a little
Yeah.
bit of a different space to start thinking about with the single push events.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. But it's fun. It's a little bit
Mhm.
of people get in the weeds, and then you're gonna be messaging us next year to ask how you can go faster up Rainier.
Well, I forgot to mention this, but when Jack was training, Jack Kunzel, one of our coaches, last spring, set the fastest known time on skis up and down Mount Blanc.
Hmm.
And Jack did more training than I think most of us would be willing to accept on a Stairmaster with a pack, with ankle weights. And it seemed to really pay off for him because it's very specific. Because, a lot of times going steeply uphill, you're not on your skis anymore. They're on your back on these mountains. And you can't skin up a 45-degree slope. So you're booting up. And
Yeah.
then the Stairmaster all of a sudden looks a whole lot like your sport.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Lots of interesting things for that. The one question I had, which people might find interesting too, when we were talking about some of these FKT type holders like a Remy or a Killian, I haven't coached any of those obviously personally, but would they have, my guess is they would have very good muscular endurance, but they're like 1 rep max squat wouldn't be insanely huge. I'm not sure. What have you found? Because you've
Probably,
coached
probably
more elites.
not.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would say probably not. I mean, I don't do any like max strength training with any of the elite
Yeah.
runners that I coach.
Yeah.
Um, but because I'm, first of all, I'm not interested in having them. They don't need to get stronger. I mean, this is the whole strength and power thing is a little complicated and can be confusing. So if you want to be power is the rate at which you can exhibit strength. It's the rate at which a muscle can contract. And so it's basically the force that the muscle could generate times the time that it takes to do that. And or divided by the time. Um, and so if strength is in the numerator and time is in the denominator, if you add more, if you make yourself stronger, there is high likelihood you will become more powerful. But again, that only works up to a point. And what these elite mountain athletes that we know of and have done is they've maximized the power while minimizing the strength.
Mm.
So because they're not by, I don't mean minimize it, by they're trying to get as much power out of the least muscle mass that they
Right.
can.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how big Remy Bonnet is, but I've seen a few pictures of him. The guy can't weigh, can't weigh 60 kilos soaking
Yeah. I
wet.
was just at the World Cups with him. He's tiny. He's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And his arms and legs look pretty thin.
Yep.
And
They
yet
are.
he's incredibly powerful going
Hmm.
uphill.
Hmm.
Now, he wouldn't be powerful, doing a clean and jerk, an Olympic style lift or something. But we have to talk about specificity here. And
Yes.
if you're really into going uphill fast, then spending a huge amount of time in a gym trying to get stronger, unless you are really deficient. And by deficient, what I often will tell people is if you can't deadlift your own body weight, then you probably would benefit from
Hmm.
getting stronger. But if you can do, deadlift 1.5 times, or even, and especially when you get up into the 2 or more times your body weight, you're way plenty strong enough for these kind of events. You just don't
Yeah.
need to be that strong. And then you'd be better off shifting your focus to something that's more specific to the event you're training for. In
Yeah.
most cases, most mountain sport cases, that's going to be muscular endurance.
For sure. And it's been interesting because I've in person watched Remy at many events now just this past month. The one thing that stands out too is his movement economy. His
Mm.
technical efficiency uphill is
He's a
unbelievable.
beautiful skier. Yeah, he's
Yes, and
really beautiful.
I think that, and I've I've been critiqued or heard this critique by many European coaches that for skimo specifically, we hyper focus on the just pounding out meters, kind of like meter meatheads,
Hmm.
and at the elite level, put almost no effort into that piece. So
Yeah.
that's more. I'm talking more for elite athletes, but it is a thing of beauty to see him literally just fly up the hill. I'm sure you've witnessed that in Nordic too, with like a Klæbo or someone else who's just
Hmm.
wildly efficient in their how they move.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and watching Remy Bonnet's uphill technique, I mean, I don't know for sure. I don't
Hmm.
know how I would find out, but if that guy didn't come from a cross-country skiing
Yeah.
background, I would be very surprised because he looks,
Yes.
and if you couldn't see below his
Hmm.
ankles, you would
Yeah.
swear he was on cross-country skis.
I
Um,
agree. Yeah.
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 So this comes down to what I think this is a really good point is that, and this is, we're going down a rabbit hole here,
Yeah.
but I think it might be interesting for a lot of folks,
Hmm.
is that economy is one of the big, we think of there's three factors that are often used as or determinants or considered to be, they're kind of universally accepted as the main determinants of endurance performance. The one that we hear about the most is VO2 max,
Hmm.
but that's also the least good predictor. It's the worst predictor of these three. The next one is your speed at your anaerobic threshold. That turns out to be a really high predictor, like 90% prediction rate of endurance performance. And then the third is economy. How
Hmm.
much does it cost you to move at race pace in your
Hmm.
event, or even if it's not race pace? Let's say you're just a mountaineer, you're
Yeah.
not trying to race, but how
Yep.
much does it cost you to go uphill at 500 meters an hour?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the thing that I've written about this before, but I've seen it with my own eyes in training, especially with cross country skiers, because that sport is very technically demanding,
Hmm.
and as a consequence, the economy can vary wildly from skier to skier.
Yeah.
And I have improved the performance of world-class skiers by 20% just focusing on movement economy. Now,
Hmm.
I know from a fact, and this without no changes whatsoever to their VO2 max. In fact, we were testing them. VO2 max did not change at all through this whole training cycle, and yet they became considerably faster, like double digit faster. The
Yeah.
economy improved, and as a consequence, since it cost them less to operate at those race speeds, that means that their speed at their anaerobic threshold will be higher.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
this whole economy thing it's difficult to train it because it takes a lot of like videoing and a lot of very
Yeah.
focused technique work to get good at it.
Hmm.
But I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for most people. And this goes all the way from runners to, well, Kylee very well. You take somebody who trains all the time on a stair machine, and then they go to climb a big glaciated mountain, and they have to put crampons on, and they're walking
Hmm.
on really
Hmm.
rough terrain and icy terrain, and their economy is great hiking on the
Yeah.
treadmill or the stair machine. And then they get
Hmm.
into real alpine terrain
Yeah.
and they have no economy for that. Their balance isn't very good. So it ends up costing them a whole lot more energy.
Yeah, for sure. It's all these pieces put together, right? The
Yeah.
training in the gym and also enough time outside where you're getting the real skills as well. I just saw one short story on social media this week. There was a Canadian alpine racer who's 81 in Nelson, and
Mhm.
he went to 2 Olympics, and he still runs gates twice a week. And a rite of passage apparently is when a 13-year-old or a U15 can beat this guy who's 80. And that's a real testament to movement economy. Like
Yeah,
he is still fast because he has such impeccable technique with the gates. And I was just
yeah.
like, wow. And even Ben Husby, one of our coaches, former Olympic Nordic skier, he enters races and does really well. He's still fit, but his technique is so much
Mhm.
better
And he's
than
pushing 60 now.
yeah,
Yeah.
than most Nordic recreationalists. So, anyways, just
Yeah.
some fun little stories to r- drive home the point, I guess. So,
Yeah.
yeah, our next question here, Scott, is from someone who is a beginner trail runner, and they live in a mountainous region. They said, for example, they have an 18-kilometer trail that has an average of 15% grade for the first 8 kilometers. And they're asking if they should do their drift test hiking versus running. And yes, I think that's the first
That's the
question. We'll
main,
start
yeah,
with that.
that's kind of the
Yeah.
big part of their
Mhm.
question here. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out what the question is because there's a
Yeah.
lot of background information, which helps.
Mhm.
But I believe the best thing to do is to do your drift test in the modality that you're going to be, training at. So, like for our mountaineers, we have them do uphill hiking drift tests on an inclined treadmill. So I would say for you, I mean, most treadmills will go to 15%. So I would say you could do your and you say you're hiking on a 15% grade. You're not running up 15% grades. So hike on a 15% treadmill to determine what your hiking aerobic threshold is.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
then doing the running, you've already done the sounds like the running drift test at 2%. But that will, so now you have, and they could be the same. I've seen them the same, and I've also seen them be quite wildly different. And I think it has to do with leg strength and muscular endurance. But I would do one of each. And then, like, let's say you have to hike the first 8 kilometers up this 15% grade, but then you get on nice rolling terrain, then you can just go to your running aerobic threshold heart rate.
Mhm. Yeah, she also mentioned, which I know you picked up on, we were chatting about this question a little bit before, um, that when she actually went and looked at the total time, her heart rate and the total time of the workouts, that she was only spending 55% of it in zone 2. And I believe she is aerobically deficient. I thought that was an interesting piece and kind of good advice for people to occasionally look like how much time are you actually spending in your 3-hour hike in the proper zones too.
Yeah. I mean, and 55%, no, very few people are going to hit 100% of
Yeah.
the time in zone, but 55% is not helping you improve your aerobic deficiency. I would
Mhm.
say shoot from, something at 80% or better would be a wise way to shift this. And that might mean that you're going to be walking a little slower or running a little bit slower, but we've just seen that work so well in terms of improving aerobic threshold, both the heart rate and the speed.
Yeah.
That yeah, we've got
Mhm.
too many examples of that working well for folks.
And then her next question here is again mentioning that she lives in a very mountainous region. So, how would you account for this in your weekly training volume slash intensity so you enjoy your long runs in the terrain you live in, but you don't overtrain? So, it sounds like she doesn't say where she lives, but somewhere where it's pretty much there isn't much flat running, you know?
Sounds like it, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, this, I guess it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is the immediate enjoyment of these long runs, even though you're aerobically deficient, then, keeping your heart rate in that zone 2 for 55% is probably the best solution. If your goal long term is to get where you can run longer for faster for several hours at a time, then you're going to need to slow down and build this aerobic base first.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can't drag the aerobic threshold up from above. You have to push it up from below gently. And that can take a long time. And in the meantime, yes, it's going to mean maybe when you go out with your friends, you're having to let them go at certain times and say, hey, I need to stay in this intensity zone. And I know that can be very difficult, but
Mhm.
I do know that it's also the most effective.
Yeah. Yeah, she asked another question, which I've actually had clients ask me too, who are aerobically deficient. She asked if muscular endurance and tempo work could live in the long run because clearly her heart rate is going up. And if you could combine those, and I know you have an answer for this, so.
Yeah, you will gain muscular endurance, and by tempo, you're trying to improve that second threshold, the anaerobic threshold. You can improve those things with long runs.
Mhm.
But if all your long runs are these are going to be very demanding. If you're doing them where there's a significant muscular endurance fatigue load and you're running a bit too fast, and you're going to struggle with recovery and eventually could fall into overtraining. So normally I don't unless I know the person very well and know their history, and usually this is going to be someone who's quite at a very high level. I don't program intensity and duration in the same workouts. I think that you get it begins to become too risky.
Mhm.
It can work, and it does work if it's applied in very thoughtful ways. But I've also seen it blow up on people and end up, after 2 weeks of this kind of training, they're just toast.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes a hard answer to wrap your mind around, that it is just going slower uphill so that you're in that zone 2 until that aerobic threshold gets higher, and then you could start layering in the other things. But
Yeah. It
yeah,
just requires patience. Yeah.
it does for sure.
Her next question is a really good one. I'd like to address
Sure.
this. That's
Yeah. Why don't you
Yeah.
go ahead?
She said, finally, I'd love to hear some advice at some point. Well, this is the point. For those looking to progress from hiking and walking hills on
Mhm.
trail runs to gradually running more of them. Um, You've mentioned that walking and running are two different types of movement, so is getting faster at walking on hills the best way to move towards running on them, or is it better to run a little, then stop and get your heart rate down, repeat? Sort of like interval training, but still within that aerobic zone. Okay, I think that this is probably something that's not particularly well understood, but in the UTMB, both Ruth Croft, who last year was second place in that race, walked in that race is 100 and what is it, like 110 miles or something like that. She
Mhm.
walked almost 60 miles of that race. And
Yeah.
not many people are going to be running up, 20, 25% grades. It just
Mhm.
doesn't happen. It's way more efficient for
Yeah.
almost all of us when you get to that kind of a gradient to walk, to hike. And
Mhm.
hiking with poles is also a huge benefit.
Yeah.
So I think we did a similar thing with Tom the year he was third at UTMB. We looked at and his probably 60%, no, 40%, excuse me, about 40% of that race was done walking.
Mhm.
And so these are people that it can cover, like in Tom's case, is covering 100, the UTMB course, 100 and some miles in 20 hours, just shy of the record at the time. And and so I think that people think they need to be running when in fact they would probably be better off hiking because it'd allow you to handle a higher volume of training than just, trying to run for 30 seconds or a minute till your heart rate goes too high and then walking again.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. It's especially because this lady said she's a beginner trail runner. I think it's just focusing on the hiking for now, and
Yeah.
the aerobic deficiency. Yeah. Good. Our next question, Scott, you'll like this one because it's from a cross-country skier. It says, I'm 63 and compete in cross-country skiing and biathlon, where my events range from 25 minutes to 3.5 hours in duration. I've been training my aerobic base for years and have had improving my fat utilization as an objective for a long time. I've not done fasted training, but in my longer base aerobics sessions that are typically 3 to 5 hours long, I've tried to not take on calories other than dilute energy drink until at least 2 hours and sometimes 3 hours into it, waiting until hunger pangs are strong. But recently I've been hearing a different viewpoint in my sport that says it's best to practice taking on carbs during training because that's what will drive performance in Nordic races. Is delaying taking on calories in training helping or hurting me? In my events, I take in some calories, but for ski marathons, hot water. I will also get food at an aid station late in races that last more than 2 hours. I usually can finish feeling pretty good, but still wonder if more calories earlier would have made me faster. How should I conduct my training to best support calorie deficit in races? And should I change how I approach feeding? And
Yeah.
this is from
Okay.
another Scott.
Good point. So you're right. There has been an increased emphasis in the past couple of years, and a lot of these were studies done on cyclists about in increasing carbohydrate intake during training. But fasted or some calorie deficit training has some benefits too, and I'll explain what I mean by that. They're doing different things, and I often say this little statement that you train on fat and you race on carbs. And this low intensity, long duration training that probably makes up a significant portion of your training volume is going to have a high component of fat as addition adding to the carbohydrate usage. But it's not as high as I used to think it was, I have to say, because we just did, Tom Evans just went to Morton in Sweden and did a 6 hour fuel utilization treadmill test because we wanted to see how does that change over time. And I was quite surprised to see how high the carbohydrate usage was. It probably was, the fat never reached more than about 40% of his total caloric expenditure. Now, but two years ago, I was working closely with a couple of Tour de France. Well, one particular Tour de France he was for the Ineos Grenadier cycling team. He was there, what they call the high performance manager or something like that. And he told us that those guys were doing some fasted training, but they do it like only on easy rides. And so let's say they're going to go for a 4 hour ride. They might do the first 2 hours fasted, and then they start taking on a lot of calories. So they get some of the benefits of the fat adaptation, but then they start taking on calories so they don't just get slower and slower through the whole session, and that helps them recover faster. And they were only doing this maybe once a week. But I got to thinking, well, there's outside of Formula One racing or NFL football, there's certainly no endurance sport that has as much science and money spent on it as elite cycling.
Yeah.
And so if these guys who are at the very top of the pile fitness wise are feeling that there's some benefit from doing a little bit of fasted training, then probably could be beneficial for most of us. But if you're going to do any kind of intensity or any kind of very long event, then you're going to want to continue to have carbohydrates so you can keep the power up for the whole time.
Yeah, Scott, is specific to your, I think you actually, you mentioned, this, Scott.
I
He's
do.
biathlon and cross country specific to his events because they aren't ultra length. What would
Mhm.
you think for him?
I think that for him, fueling, I mean, you could still get away with doing some a little bit of fasted training, Scott. I think that's not going to hurt your performance at all, but I wouldn't overdo it, and
Mm-hmm.
because it will always slow recovery. And so
Yeah.
that means you don't get as much training volume in because you need more time between workouts.
Mm-hmm.
But then, yeah, if fueling during, I mean, even though your aerobic sessions are 3 to 4 hours long, that's pretty long.
Mm-hmm.
And your training sessions, I should say, in those, I think you would be wise to take on calories and to,
Mm-hmm.
and especially if they're going to have any kind of intensity, in them, like a lot of, let's say you're out cross country skiing, and I know where you live, Scott, and there's some really big hills there. Um, then having having carbohydrates on board will really help because remember those fast twitch muscle fibers are almost exclusively using carbohydrates for fuel. And if
Mm-hmm.
you're, skiing uphill for 20 minutes steeply, um, then your legs are going to be burning a lot of carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
And so, keeping fueled up for some of those long um, skis in the rendezvous area where you live, I think that'd be really smart.
Scott, I'm curious with the elites, cross-country skiers, if they're doing a long Birkebeiner or marathon or whatever, are they following like the same, like I know most elite other sports are now ingesting, depending on your weight, but like 80 to 90 grams per hour of carbs. Would they be doing something similar?
I suspect, I mean, I've
Yeah,
not been involved in
yeah,
skiing since this phenomenon or there was been a few
started.
studies
Yeah,
that were done that demonstrated the efficacy, at least for cyclists,
yeah,
of taking in some cases, ridiculously high amount,
sure.
130, 140 grams per hour.
Yeah,
Um, so I would suspect that nowadays with skiers that they are doing the same
doing
thing.
that.
I
Yeah,
mean,
that would be
in
my.
a the world class, 50-kilometer race in cross country skiing now is done in 2 hours.
Okay.
So it's very
Yeah.
fast.
Yeah.
And it's only when you get into the ultra long distance, like the 90-kilometer Vasaloppet in Sweden,
Mhm.
where they're out
Mhm.
there for, several hours at a time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, they don't show, I don't watch cross country prolifically, but do they pass them things as they go by at aid
there
stations?
are feed
Okay.
stations along the route. Yeah,
Because they
that's
don't
typically
have
how it goes.
vests and bottles and stuff
No,
all over the place.
typically they're not
Mhm.
skiing. In the old days, when we did long races, we skied with a little fanny pack bottle thing,
Sure.
and they would put some, on my case, I used defizzed Coke
Okay. Yeah.
as as my feed because it really,
Sure.
the combination of the sugar and the caffeine was really powerful effect.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
but now, and certainly on the World Cup, there's feeding stations,
Okay.
and each athlete and each coach will be feeding, whatever that
As you go.
preferred, the type of calories that that person wants.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, this is a great question from Scott because I also have felt like it's shifted from being fat people obsessed with fat adaptation to an obsession with like I just listened to a podcast with David Roach and he won a very famous 100 miler this year and he studied competition eating, like people who eat hot dogs and stuff. So like it's switched the complete opposite way of and
Yeah,
probably like most things somewhere
somewhere in the
between
middle.
is the happy
Yeah,
ground.
yeah.
Our next question, Scott, comes from Mike, and he says, really appreciate the podcast. It keeps pulling my sprinting tendencies towards longer objectives. How do you decide how to adjust the intensity mix as goals get shorter? It seems pretty clear that Kylee is going to need more intensity for her skimo sprint training than someone training for an ultra. But how do you think about the specific adjustments in that mix from the 50-kilometer plus targets with programming described in the books down to those like 3 to 4 minutes and along the way, I guess,
Well,
distances?
I'm gonna let you answer the part that's addressed to you, but I will
Sure.
say that before you start, when I wrote those books, I wasn't thinking about 3 or 4 minute events. And so
Yeah.
that's why they're not covered at all. I mean, they're
Hmm.
because all these events that we were talking about training for, the short ones are a couple of hours and the long ones are, days long.
Yeah.
So they're very different training. It becomes much more complex when the events get short. And
Yes.
in that 3 to 4 minute range, or even up to, 8 to 10 minute range, the training becomes very multifaceted and much harder to juggle and balance. So I will just leave it at that. I mean, I have trained cross-country ski sprinters, and I
Hmm.
can, I can say that they still train a prodigious volume.
Yeah.
So a lot of low intensity training. There's still a lot of, they're still doing, 80 to 90% of their training in zone 2 or below.
Hmm.
But it's when you get into the high intensity training where it becomes very specific to the event that they're training for. Um,
Yeah.
whereas
Yeah,
in,
no,
oh, go ahead,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, Scott, I would say like you've helped me with my training for the skimo sprint, which is 3 to 5 minutes. And I can attest like your books were written with the intention of alpinism and endurance. And you could, but Scott's not a one-trick pony. He could definitely write a book on training for the sprinting uphill athlete, perhaps. So but yeah, if someone is trying to be a sprinter and they're basing it off just training for the uphill athlete, I would encourage you to read some of the articles Scott wrote because the book doesn't, I don't, you can speak to it, but you didn't write that with the intention of people doing 3 to 4 minute race efforts uphill.
No, I
Um,
never considered that at the time,
yeah.
but you have done obviously you'd have a really high training volume overall, but
Hmm.
what are some of your, it sounds like this person
Yeah.
is asking a little bit like, okay, what are some tips? What kind of intensity do you do for an event that's as short as, 4 minutes? So why don't you give us a little background on what you've been doing
Sure.
and what you find useful and not so useful and stuff like that?
Yeah, I would definitely say, especially in your off season, the volume is kept pretty high because, as Scott was saying, you still need a huge aerobic base to support it because while it's called a sprint, it's not an anaerobic effort. It's 3 minutes. I've said this before. Ironically, I was a sprinter in speed skating, and the sport was under 1 minute. And that's a completely different beast. So you still need this huge aerobic base to support a 3 to 10 minutes event. So do not neglect that. I would say the difference for me between when I trained for longer skimo and now the 3 to 4, I do spend more time in an upper zone 3. So I do more intensity for sure because that system needs to be online and you have to stimulate it. You can't, I can't just do zone 1 all day. So
Yeah. If you
uh,
tried to enter a sprint race doing nothing but aerobic base training, you'll be very disappointed.
it feels pretty awful. I would say one caution that I see a lot of people who have an endurance background and then they want to sprint. I think their volume is often much too high. If you actually want to be a good sprinter, even of this distance, it's less reps than you would think. Even in training, you're not doing like 15 3-minute reps usually at
Mhm,
zone
mhm.
3. Like that's exhausting on every level and you'll overtrain yourself. So tapering or before an event, you have to rest a lot more than I think a lot of endurance athletes think they need to. Um, And a good marker for me, and maybe you, if you're dabbling in this, is when I start to feel flat, like I don't have zip in my legs, I often know I'm not resting enough. Because
Yeah.
in order to do a good 3 to 4 minute sprint effort, you need to feel like you've got that power piece, that sharp um, next gear in your legs, which you often don't tap into maybe in an endurance event as much. So what else did I miss in terms
No,
of?
I think you hit it all. I will say one final thing on this, though, is I believe that your high intensity training, things that you're doing that get very close to looking like the demands of your race,
Mhm.
should be done as sport specifically as possible. So, going to the local gym to a spin class, while it could be very high intensity, that's
Yes.
not going to transfer over particularly well. It'll transfer over, but not
Hmm.
great to, let's
Hmm.
say, the cross country sprint or the skimo sprint. You
Hmm.
need to be training the specific muscle groups in this with the specific demands on them.
Hmm. Yeah, I would. One other thing I think is relevant for people is, that Scott taught me, and it does work, is you really, in training, you don't need to go to the well, as they say, pretty much ever. Like it just,
Yeah.
it all it does is train more toughness, but a lot of athletes are mentally tough already. So just dialing it, maybe your real maximal sessions being like 95, 90 even, um,
Mhm. And
is
stopping
yeah.
before you become exhausted. Training to
Hmm.
the point of exhaustion. I mean, that last 5% you're trying to eke out in that workout, the benefits are potentially even negative, but they
Hmm.
certainly aren't 5%. So training at 95% is going to get you probably 98% of the benefits of training, going all the way to exhaustion.
Hmm. Yeah, like that old adage of people training, they're running up hills and then vomiting and stuff. We
Yeah.
actually don't train like that. You save
No.
it for the race. You might vomit at the
Yeah.
race, but that's
Hmm.
when you have to go to the well, so to speak, and
Yeah. You need to save
110%. Yeah.
you need to save those.
Yeah, for sure. Good. Our next question is from Maddie, and he says, I live in the mid-Atlantic US. I just got a sign up for the Ultra Tour Beaufortin, a beautiful trail race near the Mount Blanc. He says it's a great alternative to the UTMB, by the way. 110 kilometers distance with 8K meters of vert. My question is, I have business up until 3 days before the race, so I only have 48 hours to acclimatize over in the Alps from basically sea level. It's not the highest altitude race. It averages 1,800 meters with a max altitude of 2,600 meters. What are my best options outside of expensive gear slash equipment to prep myself for the race, including leading up to my departure and the 48 hours I'm there pre-race? I plan on coming in very fit, and it's in July, so I have plenty of time to train.
Well, we hear this kind of question a lot from people who, because of work considerations, they're not able to go to the place where they need to acclimate for with any kind of event until just right before the race or the climb or whatever. And this does present a problem because there's no outside of using, an altitude tent and something like that. There's really no way to prepare yourself for being at altitude except being at altitude. So I
Mhm.
often have told people is like if you can't be there 2 weeks before the race, you should show up the day before. And then hopefully what's going to happen is your body won't really know quite what's happened to it. Well, you don't want it. And I think 48 hours, Maddie, could be it's right on the edge. What I've seen a lot of times is sometimes days 2, 3, and 4 are the worst days because sounds like you might be traveling a long distance to get there. And so you combine the jet lag with being at altitude. I think you're better off either try to come earlier or just, I mean, I've joked about it, like show up the morning of the race and just go from then and just like you're going to have to be tough because it's going to be very uncomfortable to to run at those altitudes when you're not acclimated. So I guess that's my, show up 2 weeks before or a day before, but
Mm-hmm.
not 3 or 4 days before. I think you've had this experience, Kylee, in
Yeah.
some of your World Cup races last year, especially, of having the race be on like day 4
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
and
sure. I
struggles.
I think, as this kind of sounds negative, but I think it's just honest, is if you do have like life things, like you have business, it's accepting that that is going to compromise your
Mhm.
ability to be as optimal as you could, and just accepting that you're going to do as best as you can within the constraints of your life. I think that's the biggest piece to because we can't lie and say that the optimal way is to acclimatize.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. But not all of us. I haven't had that luxury sometimes as well. So
that's right. And we all get forced into it
yeah.
one way or another, time to time. Yeah. This has been a great session. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions this month because there were so many, and some of them they're great questions, and we don't want to blow them off and give you a quick 30-second answer when it might be beneficial to hear a longer explanation. So we had another 5 or so questions that are quite long. In fact, we will move those into the March Ask Evoke podcast. But Kylee and I both really appreciate your sending in the questions. We're very excited that people are happy with these podcasts and enjoying them and learning something from them. So please keep it up. Keep coming back to us, or keep sending us questions that are on your mind. But thanks a
Yeah.
lot, Kylee.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Scott. And you can direct message them on Instagram or email coach@evokeendurance.com with your questions. And we will get to all of them. It just might take us some time. So
Yeah.
well, thanks, Scott.
Okay. See everybody next time.